Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Frames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend, colleague, and co-host, Darren King, also known as ExoAcademian. It's good to be back with all of you on Liminal Frames. Darren, we've talked a lot recently about how slow it's been in the UFO world, but that seems to have changed this week. In fact, quite dramatically the last couple of days. It started out kind of slow, but man, it sure has picked up. There's a lot to get through. The list we made before the show of topics we want to cover seems quite large. I think we're going to get through it all, but we might not. Fingers crossed. But Darren, before we jump into these topics, I always like to do a quick catch-up with you. How have you been? What's been going on? I know you recently ran a race. Is that right?
That is correct, sir. I took part in the Knoxville Marathon / half marathon. I ran the half marathon, and that was the first one I've run in about 8 years. When I lived in California, I ran about 7 of them, I think. Maybe not that many, 5 or 6. But I've also run a couple full marathons in my time. But it had been a while since I'd done a half marathon. So truth is, I didn't train as much as I should have because it was a little bit cold earlier in the year. But I managed to pull it off. I had only run a maximum of 9 miles, I think, the week before. So you're supposed to ideally get up to about 10 miles before you run the full 13. But it worked really well. And most importantly, I was reminded of what I love about these races. It's not about where you finish or how fast you go. It's mainly about endurance and just getting through it. It's an ordeal that you have to survive. But it's also so fascinating and so compelling because it's the best of humanity on display, is what I have found, is that everyone gathers together early in the morning and everyone's just so positive. Everyone's high-fiving each other, talking to strangers. There's music along the road, like people, like little indie bands playing along the way, people coming out of their homes and cheering you on, total strangers encouraging each other. But we get to the 10-mile mark and it's getting to be a pretty tough push for the final part. And of course, it was a beautiful day in Knoxville. Spring was fully sprung, as they say. And it just was such a nice counterpoint to what you see about humanity if you were to turn on the news. So it's a good reminder to get out and actually get in those kinds of real-world situations, just to remind yourself that some of the drama we see on display in social media and especially in news media is partly manufactured to keep people engaged and fired up and riled up, right? Because that increases screen time and those kinds of things. But in a situation like this, I felt proud to be a human being, proud to be part of that tribe, and it was just a really amazing experience.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It is so important to get out with others in community to witness the beautiful things that human beings can do when we gather together. I think about the eclipse as another great example of that happened very recently, and just watching videos, feeds from all over the world, or really the U.S., I suppose, different places where the eclipse was passing through. Mexico obviously was also a country where this occurred. And just every single one of these instances where they had this live feed, it was this unanimous outpouring of excitement and interest in the eclipse taking place. It's something we all knew was going to happen. All of us have seen imagery of what that looks like on our screens, but not many of us have witnessed it in person. And if you haven't had the chance to do that, it is really an extraordinary experience. So it speaks to the fact that we can know a lot about the world. We can cognitively understand it, but experiencing the world is an entirely different matter. And experiencing it together adds yet another layer to the quality of the experience. So I'm really glad you highlighted that, running in community experience, because it is just so important.
And also, it's interesting because it kind of ends up being like a spiritual experience because it's such a physical ordeal to push your body to keep going when it wants to stop. And in that sense, you kind of go through a dark night of the soul and come out on the other side. And when you finally see that finish line finally manifest in front of you and cross that finish line and eat an orange and a banana and some Gatorade, and food has never tasted so good, right? Because your body really, really needs it to replenish itself. It just really is an amazing experience. And it's kind of like a rite of passage. And we kind of lack those in the modern world. So I fully enjoyed it.
Well, let's get into some of these topics. We're not necessarily going to go in chronological order of when these things took place, but there is a lot to get into. So Darren, just today, in fact, we heard about another skiff which took place on Capitol Hill. We have members from the UAP caucus who were attending that meeting with members of Aero who were providing a presentation. And the reception that we got afterward sounded along the lines of what we've heard in prior skiff experiences. Nothing burger, I believe, was used again, so you can scratch that off on your bingo card at home. We also heard some reactions, like from Representative Eric Burleson, where he said what he heard today really only increased his skepticism that there was something to this at all. Now, remember, if you followed me on social media, when we had the hearing with David Grush, where David was explaining all the things that he was trying to reveal, there was a great shot of Eric Burleson, who was in that chamber, listening to David's claims, and he had such a look on his face that was like, you could tell that nothing, like things just didn't compute. So I took a screenshot of that. I said, look, this is ontological shock happening in real time. So, he likes to remind people he's from the show me state. He wants to see hard evidence that there's something there. And at least from his perspective, it sounds like he's leaning more into the fact that this might just be, government tech, government programs, that there's really nothing to all of this. I thought that was an interesting reaction, but we had a range of reactions from nothing burger to skepticism to even like full outright on display extreme frustration. And I think, you brought my attention to one of those reactions. I think it was from Representative Scott Perry, if I recall correctly. And, basically the gist of that reaction was that they couldn't get any information at all. They can't be told who has the right to have the information, who they could go to in Congress to request more information, like who would be available at all to kind of answer the questions that they have. It just sounded like a complete, you don't have the need to know. We're not going to give you any kind of breadcrumb whatsoever about how you can get more information out of this. And understandably, that would lead to quite a lot of frustration. But Darren, what were your takeaways from today's skiff and the reactions that you heard about?
Well, what you described is a great overview of what was on display, because what happens is people interpret it differently depending on what kind of material is presented, and how it's presented is really important. So some people, like Tim Burchett, for instance, was interesting there because he actually said that he was almost falling asleep at some point. So from his point of view, he goes, this is one of the tactics they use to make you like bored to death, basically. They use these procedures they run through. They say, we can't answer that, or we don't know that. And this comes down to extreme compartmentalization that happens deliberately, not just to protect information, but also so that when people are called to testify, they have plausible deniability. They only know so much, and they can only answer certain questions. And so on top of that, you also had frequently running into problems where certain people were not cleared to hear certain answers. But as we saw, one of these Congress people really frustrated around was that he wasn't even clear about how you would get those clearances and who you would even determine has the clearances and what are those procedures. Like you say, some people will come away thinking, again, if their worldview already finds it as hard to believe, they might look at this and go, this is confirming what I already thought. This is probably just deep black government tech. Other people see this as endemic of a deeper problem where there's almost like this deep state that's operating, that runs by its own rules, that's not accountable, and that plays these games to prevent even the public from ever finding out what's going on. So it was pretty interesting seeing that range of responses. But I will say this, it's interesting that at least we're hearing now about this giving way to something like field hearings. So this is still gathering momentum slowly. As much as Aero and the DoD would like to have buried this with the Aero report, that clearly didn't happen. We'll get into that a little bit later. But what this says to me is that there still is motivation, there's still momentum gaining here, and we will see where it goes from here. But certainly these Congress people seem intent on getting to the bottom of this come hell or high water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I also found particularly interesting is that you have so many of them that are saying, we'd like to have more UAP hearings and we want to have them, but we're not necessarily sure that we're going to get them. And I find that interesting because you hear that line from both parties. You hear it from folks like Representative Garcia, who's on the left, and you hear it from people like Luna and Burchett on the right, we want these hearings. We think we're going to get them, but we've got to get approval from the committee chairs to make those hearings happen. And I recall even Representative Luna saying that, she has said so many times people have tried to tell her to back off this subject, that, don't waste your time on it, don't go after it, but it seemingly has only made her more determined to pursue this further. So no timeline yet on when those hearings might take place or if, and then also the field hearings that you mentioned as well. So certainly something to keep an eye out for there. But the hearing was really kind of a period on some other information that we've received earlier in the week. One particular drop that we found was from Aero themselves, and that was the release of this Kona Blue documentation. So a presentation that was provided to the Department of Defense asking for permission to kind of create this unacknowledged SAP, codenamed Kona Blue. It was not only the kind of presentation slides that were associated with that pitch, but also some correspondence between members of the agencies who were tasked with approving and okaying this proposal and funding it. And so there was interesting kind of back and forth, and through the memos and the history there, what we knew about Kona Blue going into this drop, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, but we understood that this program was mentioned in the Aero report as a program that really was proposed but didn't get approved, got no traction, and was proposed by the group of insiders who were formerly a part of OSAP. So these would be the folks like Robert Bigelow, Hal Puthoff, Colm Kelleher, James Lukatsky. This kind of the names that everybody's familiar with. These are the folks that were pushing hard to study this further. And if you recall from, I think it was either Skinwalkers at the Pentagon or the other book that came after it from Lukatsky, where they wanted to get this SAP approved, and Reed tried to push for this SAP approval so they could gain access to more information that they had been denied. But that included things like creating their own skiffs in Las Vegas, their own research facilities. Much of that work had already seemingly been done when Kona Blue was proposed. And so it's a fascinating read, a lot of interesting material in there, just further validating the claims that the OSAP group had been making. But more so than even those claims, what fascinated me was folks who were on the receiving end of the proposal, who were basically willing to okay it. Other people who were not connected to this directly, but reviewed the proposal, including some very outlandish kinds of ideas like remote sensing, that's what we know as remote viewing, and giving the okay for that program to receive funding. So that was quite fascinating, a read for me. But Darren, what were your takeaways from the Kona Blue drop that we received?
Well, like you say, it was definitely interesting that it came out. One of the first questions is why and why now? Because clearly this was available beforehand. So they could have dropped this with the Aero report, and they didn't. So that's led some people to wonder if Chris Mellon's evisceration of the Aero report kind of put feet to the fire a little bit, so they felt they should drop something, and they did this. But of course, even people like Danny Sheehan have raised questions around maybe they have an ulterior motive for dropping this, because on the one hand, it seems like a move towards transparency, declassifying something and releasing it. But we should remember that what this basically is claiming is that something like this was set up in the case that we had recovered craft and whatnot, but that nothing like that was ever found, and so it kind of went nowhere. So it still supports their bottom line, which is there's nothing to see here. They're kind of admitting a little bit and saying, okay, there were some things put together, but nothing panned out. So this still fits with our overarching message in the Aero report, which is that most of these are misidentifications, things that can be prosaically explained with enough data analysis. So that was interesting to me. But I do think you have to ask yourself, what are the motives? Because, again, while it looks like transparency on the surface, at the end of the day, it can make people who even were suspicious about their actions, but still skeptical of this notion that we actually have reverse engineered alien tech, they can look at this and go, aha, so there is something there, but nothing that actually corroborates the notion that non-human intelligence is in our midst and that we're acquiring such technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and the Aero report itself makes it sound like this was proposed and just sort of immediately shot down. And the correspondence that you see in this release is that really wasn't the case, that it was far more nuanced of an exchange than an outright denial. So I found that to be, quite interesting, that it's not just, here's some crazy old kooky proposal from these OSAP folks, and we're just going to say no to it. No, there are some very serious names in the receiving line of that proposal that were willing to give it a fair shake, and just didn't ultimately pan out. So quite interesting there, and I agree with you. The timing is very, very curious. It certainly doesn't do enough in my mind to address many of the concerns raised by Mellon's piece in the debrief, which, if you haven't read it, it encourage you to do that. It's at least an hour long of a read. It's a long piece, but filled with tons of interesting information. And I know we're going to get into some more of that soon. There was also a release, I believe it was today as well, from John Greenwald of the Black Vault, an Arrow FOIA request that he had put in, that some documentation was released, which included emails and text messages between Chris Mellon and Sean Kirkpatrick regarding David Grush and his willingness or not willingness to come in and talk with Arrow, telling Arrow everything that he knew. One of the biggest revelations from that Foya drop was that it openly admits that there was a DOJ investigation underway related to Grush's claims. And, Grush was basically saying, well, why can't they just, why can't Arrow just get this information from, the ICIG? And they're like, well, DOJ hasn't released that to us because there's an ongoing criminal investigation. Now, that raises a lot of interesting questions. We don't obviously know the focus of that criminal investigation, but we've heard for some time now, for at least a year, that there has been kind of a FOIA embargo in place on UAP material, in part because of an ongoing active criminal investigation. This just further corroborates that, in conjunction with what we know about David Grush and the claims that he has made. So interesting stuff there to dive through. Darren, what was your takeaway?
Well, I think it's interesting because some people, let me say this, who position themselves as if they are pro-disclosure and pro-transparency, some people have suggested that even the FOIA requests that end up being approved and published by such people sometimes seem to serve the interests of the Pentagon. So again, it raises questions about whose interests are they really serving? Is it sort of a roundabout way of being a kind of psyop, where it looks like information is being uncovered and transparency is being championed, but really it ultimately leads down a path that obfuscates ultimately. So I think that's interesting. Of course, what's also interesting is that this sort of highlights the fact that some of the responses that Kirkpatrick has given publicly, as some of the interviews he's given, for instance, in Scientific American, what's interesting about it is that he just ignores the most startling aspects of this. Things like there is this ongoing investigation that maybe now even involves the Department of Justice, and that, again, the ICIG found these allegations credible and urgent. He doesn't even address that. Surely that has to be addressed in some way, because how can something be credible and urgent when there's nothing to see there, if it's a so-called nothing burger? It's also clear that Kirkpatrick, regardless of his ultimate motives, is very peeved by this entire situation and responds to Mellon at one point when Mellon raises the point that Grush did try to reach out to him. He responds by saying that is absurd and false. We hear this word absurd being bandied about often. I'm going to bring a quote up later about someone who's a NASA chief who used that word as well to describe some of these claims or allegations. It speaks to the fact that people are really baked in on a worldview, and extraterrestrial intelligence, non-human intelligence, being in our midst and being so wrapped up that the military-industrial complex has been reverse engineering crap for decades. It's so outside their wheelhouse and the realm of possibility for them that they assume it must be something absurd. They assume people must be just lacking basic critical thinking skills to think such things. And because they are so baked in on that, they often will miss evidence right in front of them. Again, we should get into what Mellon's response was to Arrow, because that really highlights the many, many problems, and I think makes clear that you can no longer argue that Arrow just did their best job but missed a few things, forgot to dot a few I's and cross a few T's, but rather it looks like a deliberate misinformation piece, and a very poorly constructed one at that was so easily taken apart. But just touching briefly on one more piece about the Kona Blue document, to some nuts and bolts people, they will find it surprising that there's mention of consciousness studies and remote sensing as one of the ways that information could be gathered. Now, those of us who've been in this field for a while recognize that psi phenomena is baked in here. We have remote viewing programs that will run at SRI, funded by the CIA and whatnot, that are wrapped up in this. Some of the same people who are involved in intrigue around the UFO phenomenon were also involved in the remote viewing programs and those kinds of things. We see some of these same names, Hal Puthoff, people like that. So it's very, very interesting, and it shows you how serious they were about this and how seriously the military-industrial complex takes these kinds of intelligence gathering techniques. And this is now part of the repertoire that we use. Though I will say, we have to remember again what people like Lou Elizondo have pointed out. And we saw some of this even on display with someone like Tim Burchett, who's a conservative religious person, who suggested perhaps that CE5 is summoning demons and something you shouldn't engage in. That shows the challenge we run into when our politicians that are supposedly trying to champion transparency are bringing their own worldviews and assumptions about what's going on here. That's not helpful. But one of the interesting things about the Cold War ramp up towards using remote viewing and psi phenomena as a kind of intelligence gathering form is that the Soviets had a very different perspective. They didn't need to understand the mechanism. They just wanted to see if it worked. And if it worked, they would use it. And later on, they would worry about how to explain how this fits with our model of reality. Americans have had a much harder time with that. We want to understand why before we're really even to look at it. We want to have proposed some sort of mechanism before we even begin to gather data around it. And it was only once the American sides began to recognize that the Soviets were galloping along and gathering supposedly important information through these means that we kind of caught up to it. But now that we're not in a Cold War, although we do have some behind the scenes, under the table kind of things going on in terms of conflict, I think we're again seeing this slowdown where these worldview perspectives and tensions get in the way of data analysis and the breakthroughs we really need to make sense of this phenomenon.
Right, and you mentioned it, but you can see it on full display with Sean Kirkpatrick and his reactions to things that Chris Mellon was saying in that text exchange. But it distilled into sort of the nugget of, well, why doesn't David Grush just come tell us everything that he told the ICIG? Why doesn't he just come talk to us and give us all the information? And you can understand why he might be hesitant to do that, right? So if you reveal everything that you know or that you've told to the oversight group, and you reveal that to another party who may, keep in mind, perhaps be complicit with some of the activities that you've revealed, then you could have a serious problem on your hand. And so you can understand Grush's hesitance if he isn't sure. He's not saying that Kirkpatrick is in on the take here. He's just saying he doesn't know. And if the right precautions aren't being made to safeguard the information, if the people haven't been read in the right way to receive that information, then he shouldn't be talking to them. And until they can satisfactorily address those questions, he's not going to talk to them. And reminding them that he already has given all this information, including 40 witness testimonies, to the ICIG. I'm frustrated. I said it before. We all want resolution to that. We all want to see more to what these claims are. I think it would be great to hear from David Grush now in light of what we've seen this week, and at least him come out and give the rest of the story or his side of the story. But even then, it's just going to continue being kind of, this is what Kirkpatrick did, this is what Grush did, and we're kind of in that back and forth state. We're going to have to really get some new information emerging to I think settle the debate there and see where that will go in the light of that new information coming out. Now, we wanted to talk about Mellon's article. We'll get into that a little bit more detail. It's a great piece. Mentioned it before. Definitely take the time to read it. It's very meaty. But my main takeaway from Mellon's piece is that it's almost like what the Arrow report should have been or could have been in terms of the level of detail that was provided about the history of UAP activity in the United States. Mellon essentially kind of pokes holes in Arrow's report repeatedly, highlighting not only its inaccuracies, its typos, the things that it overlooked, but raising very important questions that I think our lawmakers need to be considering if they're charged with being responsible for Arrow's success. Are we really getting the full picture here? Is Arrow actually doing its job that it's mandated to do? And I think Mellon's piece very, in a very well laid out manner is highlighting that no, it's not doing its job, that it could be done doing a much more thorough job than what it has. It doesn't seem to be taking these claims seriously. It doesn't seem to be presenting the evidence that certainly exists in the record that doesn't necessarily shed a positive light on the spin story that the Arrow report put out. So, what were your takes on the Mellon piece in detail?
Yeah, it was an amazing piece of thorough evisceration of the Arrow report. Clearly, Chris drew from the expertise of numerous people in the community to put together a piece-by-piece, point-by-point takedown of the Arrow report. And as you say, his takedown report was much more detailed and thorough than the report itself was, which is interesting in that alone. Now, one of the questions, of course, that you raised just then is what kind of accountability will there be for what the Arrow report was mandated to do, right? Because what Mellon makes clear in his article, because there were numerous parts they were supposed to address in this report, and several of them were not addressed at all. And he even made the point that the overall emphasis kind of missed what was really being asked for. So in that sense, now it's on Congress really to say, wait a second, we asked for these things too, where are they? So, and of course, Arrow and the DoD in general is watching to see how much they can get away with. Like we, teach people how to treat us, as the saying goes. And this is true in government accountability too. Of course, another piece, speaking of Kirkpatrick and Grush and those kinds of tensions, is around the fact that many people have suggested that from the get-go, Arrow never had the clearances necessary to get to some of these programs. They're too deep. They just don't have access at that level. And even if you do ask the gatekeepers themselves, they're going to say, oh, yeah, no, sorry, we definitely wouldn't do that. And then Arrow would say, thank you very much. Okay, check that off the list. We've done this. But on top of that, Mellon makes a great point that because of the colossal nature of this matter, the implications for the future of human civilization, this is not going to come from a mid-level kind of bureaucratic group like Arrow. And I want to quote something from Mellon's article here. He said, quote, moreover, a disruptive secret of that colossal magnitude affecting every person on the planet would never be revealed in a report to Congress from a mid-level official or organization. Only the president or an independent congressional investigation could reasonably be expected to reveal such a profound and transformative issue. If Congress wants to be confident it knows the truth, it needs to conduct its own independent investigation, unquote. Excellent point and thoroughly, I think, justified. And it also sort of lays out the groundwork for what Mellon is suggesting Congress does here. First of all, think about the implications. Think about the matter that Arrow has been tasked with investigating, and then realize they will never be the body that's going to really be able to get to the bottom of this, not just because of the clearances we talked about, but even because if government was ever going to do this, they would never do it through a mid-level kind of bureaucratic group like this. And he's saying, therefore, what this calls for is a full-on congressionally led investigation, testimony that is under oath, those kinds of things. Only that, at that kind of level, is going to uncover something of this magnitude.
Definitely. And he highlights what many of us already are aware of, and that's the really complicated history of the U.S. government with the UAP topic, that there are multiple sort of attempts throughout the history of this subject for the government to investigate it and essentially debunk it, that there's nothing to it, but programs continuing to investigate it after the fact. Highlighting the Arrow kind of glosses over entire periods of time as if nothing is actually taking place, when certainly things were taking place, pointing out that there was no mention of the Nimitz encounter whatsoever in the Arrow report. We've talked about that before. Where was the Nimitz? There were just so many glaring, sort of inaccuracies or omissions. Omissions might be the best term to use here in describing the Arrow report, because one thing Chris points out as well is that the way that they're using statistics, the way that they're using numbers, they're not actually revealing the level of unexplained activity that is occurring, the amount of unresolved activity that is occurring in the reporting that they have received, even since they've been stood up. So there's a lot that is happening, but the report makes it sound like, well, it's all just sort of done. We've figured it all out, and whatever's left is just sort of airborne trash, and we'll eventually figure out what kind of trash it is, and then we'll just close up shop, and there's nothing to see here. So it's very interesting, and it reminds me something that you said earlier in the show, and that's that will there be kind of enough public support and pressure on these agencies, on the government institutions, to really get something out? And I kind of am questioning if even enough public support is going to be enough, because the amount of control that these agencies seem to exert over the narrative here seems quite extreme. That even if you had an officially mandated committee from Congress digging into this material, I mean, how much can they actually get their hands on? It remains to be seen. I'm not. I don't know. I'm less optimistic that just the most well-intentioned UAP caucus members are going to be able to pry out the secrets on this.
Absolutely. And related to what you were just describing there, this is what I put on social media earlier today. I said, quote, "The problem is not just that the obfuscation process runs 24/7, but that DoD insiders have very little concern that the general public will ever galvanize enough around this topic to sufficiently embolden representatives to force transparency." So that was what I was noticing when I was seeing some of these representatives reflecting on this SCIF meeting today, was that they were incredibly frustrated. But as we know, the public just doesn't think about this issue very much. When you go to the supermarket and ask people, most people will still not know about this. I remember on a few episodes ago, you even mentioned your dad reflecting on what was published in the New York Times in reference to the Arrow report, and he was pretty willing to accept that, it turns out there's nothing there after all. That's what most of the public is going to think here. Most people are not prepared to believe that the military-industrial complex is able to run these incredibly black programs that are not under any kind of congressional oversight and really feel accountable to no one. And when that's the case, that really begins to make you draw some major questions around the nature of our democracy. Is it really even a democracy? Who's actually running our country? Those kinds of things. It gets pretty disconcerting once you begin to unravel the sweater, so to speak. And this also gets to what I was saying earlier about Chris Mellon and how he points out that the report itself doesn't even address what Congress asked it to do. So again, the question is, what will Congress do now? Will Congress really hold to this notion that they represent the people and that Arrow and all of these DoD programs and departments work for us ultimately, that they use our taxpayer money to run their programs? This is what Mellon said in that article. Quote, "The congressional legal mandate, meaning by statutory law, required that this Arrow historical report present the detailed history of UAP as recorded in the U.S. government records. However, Arrow instead presented a summary history of the records of flawed USG investigations of UAP, rather than what was actually mandated, the history of UAP and relating to UAP, meaning the history of UAP sightings and investigations, and to be completed using USG records and other official information." He goes on to say, "The law required a, quote, written report detailing the historical record of the United States government relating to unidentified anomalous phenomena," unquote. And the word investigations nowhere appears. The phrase does not say it has to be a historical report solely relating to investigations of unidentified anomalous phenomena. So again, his point here is that they're kind of doing this bait and switch here, because they're saying, okay, well, we'll look into the investigations of UAP, which we know were flawed to begin with. So to just echo what those reports found is kind of like just the cat chasing its own tail here, because we know the allegations are that these different investigations in the past were never meant to get to the truth. They were cover-ups themselves. So if all you're going to do is echo those findings, you're just going to do more of the same. So this just points to not just how the Arrow report was flawed, but how we're now facing a kind of constitutional crisis in a way, a democratic crisis, where we ask ourselves, how much are we going to hold these different groups to account? And as the founding fathers have been pointed out, though, if the public itself is content to stay uneducated on these issues and is not putting feet to the fire, then what kind of pressure are even our lawmakers going to feel to really do the hard work it's going to take to uncover some of these programs?
It makes me wonder how large are our institutional blind spots. It makes me think back to 9/11, for example. How could we have seen this coming? How could we have not seen this coming? And interagency sharing of information. But so much of this, if you look at what Arrow is doing, if you look at Kirkpatrick's attitude towards the entire topic, really for me highlights these extreme institutional biases that our system would never sort of lie to me if we asked do you have a program like this? It would never not tell me that. I would never not have access to all the programs that I'm supposed to have access to. We would never be conducting a black operation to the extent that has been claimed by David Grush. That's just not something that we do. Or if we did it, I, in my position, would know about it, right? This is really the refrain that you continue to hear, is that, that this can't possibly be true because, we would know about this. Well, it seems to be that there is enough evidence, at least from my standpoint, that there is there to it, and that we need to be willing to examine these blind spots, because if we're not going to look at them seriously, we're going to be liable to be hit from that blind spot in a way that we're not prepared for. And that's the argument that many of the proponents, the champions of the UAP topic, have been making for so long, is that we really need to take this seriously. Which brings me to the next point that I want to talk about, and that's the issue of these drone swarms, right? And it's the same confounding problem. We continue to hear about quote unquote drone incursions over very sensitive facilities where they shouldn't be able to operate with just impunity, but they are. And then we get folks who come in front of Congress supposedly to answer questions about how that can happen. And the answers that they're providing are completely inadequate. And Congress is essentially saying, well, I guess we just got to give you some more money so we can properly resolve this weird drone problem we're having, right? I mean, it seems pretty strange, I guess. I mean, but it's just drones, so we'll figure this out. Meanwhile, you've got international conflict happening in the Mideast. You've got Iran launching 300 drones and missiles towards Israel, and all of them being intercepted by the Israelis and the U.S. and other international partners through the means of interception that they have at their disposal. So clearly we can do something about drones in the sky. It's not like there's some magic to them that they can't be shot down. And it begs the question then, what exactly are these drones that are swarming our sensitive facilities? Why can't we do anything about them? I totally understand that, shooting something down over a civilian area could be incredibly dangerous, but we have apparently many means of taking care of these and addressing these threats, but we're not using any of them. We're not also, we have no idea on their point of origin. We have no idea on where they're returning to. You're telling me with persistent surveillance that we have no answers to these questions? I find that highly implausible. So, again, it's either blind spots in our just arrogance, like we can't possibly be, toyed with by these drones, so I'm not going to worry about it. They must be just hobby drones, or we're just not being frank with the American people. And I think it's pointing more and more to the latter.
Indeed, it is, and it's interesting because I've discussed neurolinguistic programming, NLP, several times on this podcast, and this comes to mind again because in previous eras, the Project Blue Book era, swamp gas and planets that were misidentified was kind of how these things were dismissed. Now, drone has become this catch-all term that people use to calm people's nerves. And what it does is it immediately has a neurological impact. When people hear the word drone, even the word itself sounds kind of boring and plain and not too exciting. And so it immediately puts you in a different kind of state of mind. And that's intentional, right? We have to remember that. And of course, basically anything that's not clearly a helicopter or a jet is going to be called a drone. But of course, when you think about that, that could apply to many, many, many things. Now, speaking of this is something Chris Mellon also commented on. I think it's worth including this quote here. He said, quote, "Yes, one of a growing string of similar incidents in which we have been unable to identify or engage these unmanned vehicles. They are not even trying to conceal their presence, yet operate with impunity for weeks in restricted airspace. to the point fighters were relocated from Langley to other bases. If the Air Force can't control the air over Langley, how can they control the air over Washington? I encourage people to go to the War Zones website and search these terms: drones in Guam, or drones in Colorado, or drones in Palo Verde, or drones in FAA or Arizona or Navy, and see what you find. Most people think drones are just a problem for countries overseas. Not true. We have a big problem here in the U.S. and still no clue where these things are coming from or why, unquote. Again, I'm just kind of laughing as I read that term drones over and over again. It kind of drones you into a mindless kind of non-thinking kind of state. But what's interesting here is that his point is well taken, that he's saying that if we have to actually relocate our jets to other air bases because they're being interfered with, intimidated by, you could even say, these drones, what does that say of us being the premier national defense in the world? We can't even control airspace not all that far from Washington, D.C. So what would happen if these did tomorrow show up over the White House? Will we just say, oh, weird, we don't know what they are, that's strange. We're going to take these F-18s and send them somewhere else because they're kind of annoying and they're distracting us, while we have to face the fact that these things could bomb or go kamikaze on the White House for all we know. It's just preposterous that this is not raising more concerns again. And of course, this is interesting because it also brings up additional questions around what are these things? Where are they from? Why are they doing what they're doing? So what we're seeing here is not aggressive behavior in the sense they're never attacking, they're never launching, they're never firing at our military forces, but they're clearly demonstrating their capability to be in our midst and do what they want. So what you could argue, I would suggest, is that if you have the DoD basically saying nothing to see here, move on, but then you have this other element that keeps showing up and in increasingly considerable ways over more and more sensitive airspace. So first you had this happening over the Atlantic or off the coast of San Diego. Now you're having it happen within 100 miles or so of Washington, D.C. over the continental U.S. and being so distracting that it's causing us to have to redirect fighter jets to other air bases altogether. You could make the argument, you could construct a narrative saying that whatever forces in the DoD are trying to shut this down, there's another counterforce that with their actions is deliberately creating a hornet's nest, kind of stirring up the news here so that it is forced to be dealt with even as the DoD tries to quiet this down. So when you think about it from that kind of perspective, I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, it makes me think of the Ghost of Christmas Past and sort of when he first appears in that story. It's like, you're not really here. I must have eaten something. There's nothing to see here. But it can persistent and continuing to dog him to the point where he can no longer ignore it. That's what we have here. It seems to be not only can it operate with impunity, but it wants to be seen. It's not just that it's it's not confronted in any way. It wants to be seen. It's trying to get attention. The fact that our fighters can't even land in that area. These are the planes we have to engage things in the sky with. We can't literally engage the things that raises some huge questions. And is this a nation state actor? This seems to be like the common, I think, rejoinder to this. It could be something that's non-human. It's it must be just advanced tech from some other country, spying on the United States and its assets. Well, I mean, the last time that I checked, that's an act of war, or certainly could be. They're not supposed to be in our airspace, at least not to that degree. And the fact that we aren't willing to call a spade here and issue some sort of repercussions to this activity, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. This isn't just the hobby drone club of Virginia, doing whatever they do in their spare time, making fun light shows in the sky. The criminal result of that would be extreme. There must be an extreme penalties for doing that kind of activity over these sensitive facilities. So it definitely does beg the question, why are they happening? Who is behind them? What is the reason for these incursions? Is it to keep the topic in the fore of the conversation? Is eventually to force our hand to address these issues in a more thorough way, so we cannot ignore them any longer. I'm definitely keeping my eyes peeled for what this, where this continues to go. But, beyond that, you kind of hinted at, sort of who's responsible. We've gotten into this issue of, is it a singular group? Is it a plural group? The more and more that we talk about this, the more sense that I have that there seem to be different competing factions at work. I don't know if you, have a heightened sense of that now, but it seems like there's no one clear agenda behind trying to get this information out.
Indeed. And what we'll do in the second part of the show here is dive into that a little bit and parse that out. But just to give some context again, so people really understand how startling these incursions are. As Nathan pointed out, we have this counterpoint in terms of contrast, where recently, a combination of Israeli forces with the help of Allied forces were able to shoot down 99% of the drones and missiles launched from Iran. And it was a considerable launch from Iran. That was really a lot of their arsenal they put towards Israel. And yet we are to understand that these drone incursions are not just strange, but we're never able to intercept them. We can't shoot them down. We can't examine them. This brings to mind the shoot downs that happened, 23 was it, where the questions were again, who was it? What was it? Why do we not have a briefing on what was recovered? Was anything recovered? What was the nature of those objects as well? And just to give a bit more clarity on these particular incursions and just how startling what happened was, Dean Johnson on social media said the following, quote, "At a hearing before the U.S. House of Representatives Armed Service Committee today, Representative Rob Whitman said, we saw recently a very disturbing trend at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, where because of a large number of UASs that were in that airspace, Langley had to close down just to make sure that we were able to defend the operations that were going on there." This was said by Secretary of the Air Force Frank Kendall. So this is just preposterous to think that this could be, as you say, it's not some hobby club. This is not some cutting-edge commercial drone. And to the point you made, if this is, as some people suggest, indicative of the fact that one of our nation-state adversaries has made a leap in technology, it's one thing if they made a leap in technology and we happen to stumble upon them, testing these things in the Arctic or in the middle of the ocean. But they're doing it over our most sensitive airspace, over our military groups, only 100 miles or so from Washington, D.C. As you point out, that would be considered an act of war. You just don't do that and go, can we get on the back channels and ask them not to do that? It's a bit annoying. No, it's much more than that. It's a clear act of war, and that's how it would be regarded. And the fact that we're not hearing that kind of response from U.S. representatives tells us that they are pretty sure this is not any of the known state actors. So as you pointed out, that raises the question, what else is on the table? Some people immediately jump to, this is clearly NHI. This is non-human intelligence that is becoming more and more brazen in their interactions with us. I just want to give a bit more context here so we can think about what's happening and then try to make sense of who might be doing it and why. So I think also of Ryan Graves' testimony on the Joe Rogan show, where Joe is asking him how they became aware of these things. And he said, first of all, it was an upgrade in radar technology was showing these things being in the airspace, in and around what these F-18s were doing. And then they began to see them at a distance, I think. And then it really changed when one day a guy walked in with full air pilot regalia, walked in, clearly was upset or disturbed in some way, and reported to Ryan Graves that while he was in tight formation with other F-18s, we're talking about, 20, 25 feet between these F-18s, one of these things dropped right between them. So that's about as brazen as you can imagine, right? Because it's basically not only in your airspace, but it's now engaging with you, and in a way that if something were to go wrong just a little bit, you're taking out a jet, right? So you're not launching at it, you're not trying to play a game of chicken exactly, but at the same time, you're doing things that are clearly meant to say, we're here, what are you going to do about it? So take that into mind, and then take into mind what's happening with these most recent drone incursions. Again, it seems highly unlikely that that would be China or Russia because of the implications of what would that mean geopolitically. So then again, some people say it's NHI. They are upping the ante, and that would make some people perhaps a bit nervous that maybe this means the NHI are beginning to move towards engaging with us in a kind of military way. Other people would say that this is a coded message from NHI saying, stop with your military development. This is what we're here to say. And people make that same argument when UAP/UFO show up over nuclear weapons facilities. They think the coded messages there that they're trying to bring attention to the collective insanity we engage with when we develop these kinds of weapons. But there's another possibility, and that is that this is a rogue human group. So therefore, it's not one of the usual nation-state actors. It's not even necessarily part of the usual chain of command within the military-industrial complex of the United States. It may be a group that we've heard talked about. People like Richard Dolan have talked about this. People like Stephen Greer have talked about this. Elements of the military-industrial complex that have gone so rogue that they're basically acting with no accountability and not even any awareness from the usual chain of command in terms of what they're doing. So that's one possibility. And again, some people have argued that what if this is the false flag threat that people like Greer have talked about? Or basically this is going to be staged like an alien invasion. It's going to be staged like these are aggressive adversarial alien groups, and it will involve basically them, these rogue human groups, gaining control over the planet, but doing it in the guise of being an alien invasion. That's one possibility. But again, what you could also argue is that this element of the military-industrial complex perhaps wants to see this addressed finally by the public, wants the public to be aware of what's going on. So what if a faction of this deeply black program has split off and is actually now acting to deliberately provoke the military-industrial complex so that the DoD has no choice but to begin to talk about this, because it's becoming more and more brazen, more and more open about these kinds of incursions. And if you ask yourself why, one potential possibility would be because they are trying to force the issue with disclosure. And what's interesting about that is that I know I discussed with you when those shootdowns happened, that was partly what I was hearing, is that there was partly reverse engineered craft that were being paraded around as a way to push disclosure. Because even if you know those aren't actually UFOs from aliens, the fact that there are these really advanced technologies that are the product of reverse engineering programs in the long run takes you back to disclosure about where that technology came from to begin with. So I think those are some possibilities we have to bring to the stage here to try to make sense of what's going on.
All right. Well, I can hear in the back of my head here the voice of my other co-host, DJ. Whenever this conversation goes into the topic of, black projects and sort of red versus blue activity, he definitely gets very skeptical of that. That you've heard this argument before, like how could it be our tech or some sort of proximate group that is to the United States operating in these areas where we're flying our airplanes, where we're conducting our exercises. Like, we just wouldn't do that. That wouldn't be something that we would do. And if it in fact really is a rogue operation, as you say, it does bring into question maybe some of our assumptions about what this group might be. I think one common assumption that we might have is that, for example, you've heard this in the lore, and you followed you for a long time, that yes, there's a rogue group working on this topic. These projects are deeply black, but their loyalties, their allegiances are still to the United States. And that may be a completely false assumption. It's very possible that with enough time, enough technology, enough capability, and enough international cooperation, that an entirely new kind of apparatus emerges. And I know this all sounds highly speculative, so just humor me as I kind of follow this rabbit hole here. But you could see how that could happen. You could see how with enough capability, enough time, enough power, that a group with this technology could basically do what it wants, and then its loyalties, its allegiances aren't to a single nation state anymore. That clearly they maybe have operations wherever they want to have operations, and we've heard about this. Showing up in remote places, grabbing whatever craft they want or any other resources they want, and then getting out right away. The whole thing that happened down in Peru comes to mind. The sort of the jungle attacks that were talked about many months ago. So this is what sort of affronts us, because it's like, how could these groups possibly exist in a world where we're so accustomed to these nice, neat nation-state boundaries? You're on this team and I'm on this team. We're we're not even used to international cooperation, so it couldn't possibly be the case that there's a third-party actor separate and apart from the main players.
Right. And again, the term that comes to mind here is one that Richard Dolan developed, which is that of a breakaway civilization. So that basically, in a phrase, describes what is in play here, potentially, is that basically you have a group that stumbles across technology that's so next generation, beyond next generation. It's generations ahead of anything else. And it also changes how you are able to develop energy, for instance, because that is part of the technology that's uncovered. And a group that stumbles across technology that far advanced from everything else would have the capacity to basically leapfrog, like you say, the usual chess pieces on the board. Some people have suggested that's what the data suggests. Again, I will argue for nuance because I think we have numerous different non-human intelligences here. I think we have intelligences here that are partly human, but partly from the future with a mix of something else and a combination of technology and organic kind of makeup. And I think we have very likely something very close to a breakaway civilization where you have groups, again, when you think back to even some of the full spectrum dominance that Danny Sheehan has talked about, you have these groups who had transnational kind of ambitions. It wasn't just they wanted to control what happened in the United States. Some of these same players fueled the rise of the Third Reich in Germany, right? We have the whole thing with Operation Paperclip. We brought over these Nazi scientists and they basically ran our space program, our rocket development. And they did the same thing in the Soviet Union. They took half of the Nazi scientists, we took the other half. And that became, part of what happened with the Cold War, was all an extension of that. So some of those same players going back well into the early and middle part of the 20th century might have been in play here. And again, they already were very rich groups that were kind of the elite of society and controlling many different industries and whatnot, and basically structuring American democracy, American politics around how could best serve their commercial interests. And it's not a stretch to think they would eventually want to have that kind of transnational control as well, which raises concerns that people have brought up around multinational corporations and how they, in some ways, run the world more than nation states do, because their interest and what we're dependent on them for is transnational at this point, basically. So this is what I'm asking for, is to be able to consider the possibility of this breakaway civilization. But again, even within a nuance, within that nuance, it may be that, for instance, as part of the original deeply Black programs that developed some of this technology, you have some people who are dead set against getting this out. They want to carry on the cover-up. They want to absolutely keep this to themselves. But you have to remember, by now we've gone through generations. Some of these people inheriting these positions and this technologies and this knowledge are inheriting it from previous generations. And they might come across this and think, wow, this is too much. This absolutely is something the public deserves to know. And that might mean we have a split even within these deeply Black groups, or the legacy of these deeply Black groups, where some are actually choosing to push for disclosure. And they are the ones that are brazenly parading these technologies that are the product of reverse engineering programs, because they know that ultimately they'll lead back like a smoking gun back to this question of disclosure about non-human intelligences and the development of this technology. So I think we have to keep in mind all of these possibilities and how it might not be one answer or another, but multiple answers simultaneously.
Yeah, it's a whole lot to digest there. The range of possibilities that are at play. It makes me think too of the book from Tom DeLonge, Chasing Shadows, I think it was, where there's sort of factions, transnational factions that are kind of warring with each other. You've got rogue elements with the technology that are kind of fighting other rogue elements with the technology in the same airspace, and they're just human. They're not even non-human. And then there's the third element, which is the non-human groups themselves. And even then, there are multiple different groups. So it's far more complicated than kind of a us versus them and black and white thinking is often the case. But it's frustrating to, I think, for the average listener who's not as deep into this topic as you and I are. What the kind of things that they're hearing in the public conversation are things that really do kind of put the kibosh on this talk in general, right? It's sort of quotes like what you quoted to me earlier from the SETI chief, about there's, we've never had any contact with anything that's extraterrestrial. We never have, there's no way this could exist. That kind of talk from these official places, that's what we've been hearing our entire lives. We've been hearing, the phrase little green men and getting Snickers from that phrase our entire lives. And what does that do to the public conversation? Well, we can see what it's doing, right? Even as it begins to emerge and we have people that are willing to talk about this in serious tones, people from within the military, people from within political persuasions, people from the scientific community, willing to say, hey, let's take this seriously. Even those people are met with, and some of them even are themselves saying these kinds of phrases because they're uncomfortable. They're just implicitly uncomfortable with the entire notion that this could be a possibility. And you have to examine that. I think you have to really look at that very seriously and ask yourself, why is that the case? Why is it that we have so strongly predisposed ourselves to thinking that this can't be possible, that there's just no way extraterrestrials could be here? There's no way, we've cracked anti-gravity. There's no way these things couldn't have occurred. It wouldn't look like this. That's the common phrase that we hear too. It just wouldn't look like that. It would look like this or that. And I know what this advanced technology would be. Why do we have these biases to begin with? Why have we closed our opportunity space, our possibility space to the very notion? And I think it goes really, really far back. And we've talked about in prior shows this concept of neuro-linguistic programming. And I wonder, Darren, it seems to me that this is just almost more prevalent than ever, or at least it's just a part of our almost social fabric, that it's just baked in. How do we break free of some of those sort of knee-jerk reactions and tendencies that seem to be on display here?
It's a good question. And just to give people some context in terms of what you're referring to in the SETI chief, this is what the SETI chief said regarding evidence for alien technology. He said, we have no evidence and we never have. And then he added, the idea that the government is keeping something like this secret is just totally absurd. There's that word again, absurd. There's no motivation to do so, unquote. Now, of course, again, you can take that comment apart so easily because, again, he's concluding based on assumption that there would be no motivation to do so. I can think of 10,000 motivations to do so. You just have to think outside of the box you've been stuck in. And again, it's interesting how he uses the term absurd. We've seen Sean Kirkpatrick use that a lot. In his response to Chris Mellon, he called the comments of David Grush absurd and false. So this is above and beyond. This is not just saying that's technically incorrect. It's saying that you are insane or a fool to even entertain such notions because they actually are absurd. So that, to your point, speaks again to a kind of neurolinguistic programming. Now, I just quoted the SETI chief there, who is so adamant that we have no such technology and never have, and no evidence of ET life. I also mentioned to you this one program I saw. It might have been News Nation or Fox News. I'm not sure what it was. But they had this military commander who was being asked about these incursions, these quote-unquote drone incursions. And what happened is the reporter, the person sitting at the desk, said, of course, we're not talking about little green men. Just in general, do you think we have something to be concerned about with UFOs? And everybody else on the panel started laughing. And his co-host even said, that's a pretty good day when you get even the commander to laugh. That's a good sign. So they all had to go through that little silly game before he even answered. And by then, everybody was disarmed, right? And so he said, to be honest, not me personally, I don't worry about that. I worry about things like China and Russia. And he went on, right? But of course, the damage was already done because even framing the question in such a way made it that it was almost like, I have to ask this, but I'm kind of embarrassed to do so. And please just take it somewhere else quickly. And the commander was happy to do so. To your point, the question is this just because we still have some stigma to get past? Or is this evidence of some sort of secretive program that has to do with mass mind control? And I know some people will be suspicious of that and think that sounds like too much like a fantasy novel or something. But we know, we have evidence that the U.S. government has engaged in serious investigation around mind control. We think about notions like the Manchurian Candidate, for those of you who either saw the original movie or the remake with Denzel Washington. The idea there is that certain words become coded messages that put into action certain programming in people's minds. What if part of what's in play here is that these silly little terms do exactly what happened amongst that group of people that were talking about this thing on national news? It disarms people, it makes them laugh, it puts you in a relaxed state of mind where you're not really in a position to dig deep anyway. This is what comes to mind here. I mean, the added implication here, and I haven't really dug into this too much on the podcast yet, although I do look into it in my own investigations, and that's around these rogue groups developing something as advanced as a breakaway civilization, but this also leads to notions like the secret space program. These programs that are involved in very, very nefarious activity, including not just drug trafficking, but even human trafficking as part of these endeavors. And that mind control and the ability to fragment the human personality, to put people through these really horrific situations, but then fragment their personality so much that they can't even fully remember in one state of mind everything that's happened, right? So you actually have compartmentalization happening within the human mind for some of these people that have been subjected to this. And even if they are able to remember something enough that they can say it to someone else, they won't be taken seriously because the technologies involved, including the manipulation of space-time, for instance, is so advanced that no one's going to believe that human groups have those capacities. It's only the alien groups that supposedly have those capacities. But again, when you think about the fact that some of this technology has been in human hands for 70 years now, it makes you ask questions around how much development has happened since that time. If we see clear evidence of space-time manipulation from these original technologies from the NHI, how far have human groups gone in developing that same kind of technology? So we at least have to ask these questions. I understand for some people who would like a nice, tidy answer, this is not helping. This is only complexifying the situation. But I think when I look at the fullness of the evidence, I see not just multiple NHI involved, as well as some groups, again, that are kind of more like future humans that have an element of Homo sapien DNA, but they're also more than that. They're partly technological. They're partly engineered organics in some ways. But you also have different elements of deeply Black groups that have either gone rogue or become fully independent civilizations that are basically working with technologies that are so next generation that no one would even believe it, even if it was exposed. This is kind of what we have to bring to mind when we try to make sense of what's happening in our world right now.
Yeah, it's I feel almost untethered from the ground. You know, there's a lot that you're bringing to the table there that I think, you know, for many in our audience, for even myself included, it's difficult to sort of treat that with the seriousness that it may deserve. The reality is that, you know, we've got a very complicated lore. We've got a very, you know, complicated history with the subject. The possibility space when you're talking about advanced technologies is almost an infinite possibility space. And so it sort of leaves open this, you know, door to all these different, you know, possibilities and ideas. And I think you put a compelling case together that these, you know, sort of different groups, different factions are very much a part of the mix, or at least they certainly could be. And, you know, you and I have talked a lot about as well, sort of why, you know, what, not only like sort of are these, you know, why are these sort of factions developing and kind of fighting or pushing this way or that way, but, you know, what is it all leading toward, if anything at all? Maybe we're just sort of caught up in the middle, right? We're the people of Earth, the average, you know, sort of citizen of the planet is just caught in the middle of this, you know, whatever it is, conflict. You know, but why? You know, are we going somewhere with this? Is there an ultimate conclusion? You know, what are the trajectories that are at play here? You know, you've mentioned before that there are, you know, some agendas that want, I guess, like the best for humanity, some that don't care about humanity, and you have, you know, sort of other factors like the whole, you know, cataclysm, and you know, that might be a looming issue that we have to kind of come face to face with. You know, help me make sense of all this. Like, how can you have all these things happening at one time? What is the real sort of through line narrative here? Because it it does seem, again, just taking an outsider's perspective, outside looking in, putting on that hat for a second, it does seem to be, all quite confusing and just, highly speculative. So help me piece this together. What's going on here?
I would say a couple of things. First thing I would point out is that we are used to, from our education in public school and even in university, we are used to hearing one history. As the expression goes, history is written by victors, right? Those who lost the war are not the ones that are writing the history. We think about the plight of Native Americans and how it was only over generations and decades that we began to tell the story a little bit differently. We think about Columbus Day, right? And we don't celebrate that like we used to. At least many people don't, because we recognize now how much the plundering of the native populations and the domination by European group that just assumed they were morally superior is involved here. We realize that history is much more complex than that. And from some perspectives, history is exactly the opposite of what is portrayed. So the problem with that is not just that we get the wrong history sometimes, but that we get this notion that history is one-dimensional, when actually what's going on is multifaceted all the time. Psi phenomena is real. We have known this for a long time. This has been part of the research for over 100 years now, parapsychological research. Quantum mechanics makes clear that our notions of determinism and the way the world works and whether or not space-time is even really real, that gets called into question, but we're not really dealing with that. That's not something that is on the 6 o'clock news or on CNN or whatever, right? So we are already aware of many nuances, many wrinkles in reality that we just choose not to look at because it's too much. We also think about the work of people like Don Hoffman, who pointed out that the evolutionary process is designed to keep us alive so we can propagate the species full stop. And that means actually a truncation of reality, and not just a truncation of reality, but a translation into the shortcut of an interface with icons that gives us just enough of a picture that we can follow these basic steps and stay alive. That's it. And he would argue again, mathematically, that the chances that what we're encountering is actually base reality in our perception is precisely zero. So we see also in non-default states, in non-ordinary states of consciousness, that people encounter this broader reality where they do encounter beings. We don't just encounter beings through alien abductions or sightings in the sky, but through psychedelics, through DMT ingestion. You could actually encounter these machine elves, these beings that seem to have ontological independence, that different people from different walks of life will encounter the same kinds of beings. This, of course, stretches our notions of what's real and what counts as an ontologically independent being, but that seems to be what this is pointing towards, that actually what these psychedelics do and what other kinds of non-ordinary state or contact modality experiences do is they take down our filters. So they're not projecting something that's not real. They're actually reducing the dampening capacity of our usual default evolutionarily derived filters so we experience more of reality. So what I'm getting to here is that we are not only socialized to have a limited understanding of what's going on in one history or in one trajectory, but even our very perceptual set is already a truncating, a dumbing down of a much more broad reality. And we're now getting to the point where now that we don't have to be so fearful that lions are going to eat us, or that we don't know where our meal's coming the next day, we can begin to slow down and begin to broaden our awareness. And I think that's what the future entails, if we can get past this bottleneck again. So now we bring that to this question of what's involved here. First of all, even within what we conceive of physical reality, there are many different kinds of beings that seem to have the capacity to cross domains, that may be arriving from a different domain, whether that's a different dimension or whatever, but they seem to adjust their frequency and be able to manifest in a way that we perceive them. But there are many, many other entities that already are coexisting, but in ways that we just don't perceive them or only perceive them in non-ordinary states of consciousness. The reason why I'm drawing this really complicated picture is just to point out that, again, as Bernardo Castro pointed out, we desire closure. We always have. Rather than science eventually learning a lesson in humility and saying we should be very cautious about assuming we're 99% there because we've so often been proven wrong in that assertion, we keep doing it not because we think it's true, but because we don't like admitting we just don't know that much yet. So this is part of the problem here. in all the ways we look at reality. And the matter of the UFO phenomenon and that complexity is just one wrinkle amongst that whole entire picture.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. That's it's helpful, and it makes me think about one thing we talked about before the show, and that's this notion of conflation, and how we tend to kind of take all these complicated things and reduce them down, into a single thing. It's just easier for us. You mentioned closure. I think that's such a powerful concept. People really need to spend some time thinking about that, how important closure really is, the role that it plays, not only in your individual life, the narrative that you tell about yourself, but the world that you find yourself in, the way you explain how things are, how things should be, how things will be. Closure. It's a huge player in this entire story, and it's led to some very interesting theories about what has taken place. Here I'm thinking of some of the biggest names in ufology. John Keel and Jacques Vallée. Both of which have put forward similar hypotheses to say that there's kind of an overarching thing at work. And it is doing something on us. It is controlling us in a certain way. It is presenting to us in these mysterious spectrum of manifestations, but ultimately it is the same thing, and it's just got an agenda that we're not aware of. That's an example of looking at something really complex and kind of reducing it down to a single actor. But I think what you're getting at here is it's far more complex than that. That's a nice story, but it's just not really the adequate story for what's at play here.
Indeed, and I think we have to be always aware of our own psychological preferences in these kinds of situations. We have to ask ourselves, again, when there's a lack of peer review and where science is not actually engaging in these matters because it just doesn't think this could possibly be the case, then as I've said before, different ufologists, different UFO enthusiasts will basically gear towards any kind of hypothesis they prefer. And sometimes that means they willfully ignore huge amounts of data. They might explain away the data, so they don't think that counts, or they're skeptical of that data. But it's not usually a very objectively grounded way that they do that. And so some people will look at what Vallée and Keel have done and say, bravo, that's amazing. You did it. You put this together. You had one grand unifying theory for the phenomenon. But again, we have to be aware of our psychological tendency to prefer those kinds of answers, right? Even in cosmology right now, we are looking for one grand unified theory. We're trying to understand how quantum mechanics and classical physics can work together in one grand unifying theory. As Bernard had pointed out, sometimes abhor paradox, and that perhaps there's something in the quantum information that says you can never nail things down as much as you would like to, and the mere act of observation biases the result, that you can't change the fact that you are part of the process. Now, conflation is an important word here because I think, again, we have many different levels of it, not just where people try to conflate numerous actors into one overarching phenomenon, like Keel called it the super spectrum. Vallée has referred to it as the control system. But again, also even within one species of non-human intelligence, you will have subtly different agendas. This thing that's strange is we have no problem recognizing that human beings do this all the time. We have a million nuances and gradations in terms of what we believe and how we act. And yet we want aliens to be this homogeneous unit that's easy to understand because we don't like the unknown. Again, we're back to our psychology, right? Our evolutionary psychology. So when we're engaging with something that's unknown, please make it as simple as possible. Use as few tones as you can so that I can bring it into my awareness without causing too much cognitive disruption, right? That's basically what we're asking for. But I wrote down a few definitions of conflation in a few different fields to help address this a little bit. Generally, conflation refers to the merging or combining of two or more distinct concepts, ideas, or entities into one, often resulting in confusion or oversimplification. So that's what I've already pointed to. In political science, it is said that conflation refers to the merging of distinct political concepts or ideologies into a single, often oversimplified or misleading framework. This can occur, for example, when different political ideologies are inaccurately equated or treated as interchangeable. Now, I want to bring that to mind here because, as I pointed out before, Sometimes when people hear about a collective intelligence, a collective consciousness, they bring to mind notions of the Borg on Star Trek. And the Borg was clearly not portrayed in positive ways. And so people assume the second you get rid of individuality or this collective understanding seems to direct affairs, that must be a bad thing. So again, that's a conflation, I would say, that they're assuming those two are equal or interchangeable, and they're really not. And finally, we have data analysis definition of conflation. In data analysis, conflation refers to the combining or merging of different data sets or variables that represent distinct phenomena, potentially leading to inaccurate conclusions or interpretations. I'll hand it back to you to give me some feedback on that. But when I look at what we do with the UFO phenomenon, which very name, right, kind of hints at it being one thing, we're doing that left, right, and center.
I couldn't agree more. I think we need to be taking this notion very seriously and combining it with the notion of closure. I mean, they really go hand in hand, right? We're just trying to, put a period on the sentence here so that we can say, this is what it is. This ties back even to our own notions of objectivity, right? Our need to have, that this thing is either true or false, this bivalence, right? All these things are wrapped together. As you said, paradox itself may be baked into reality. And that's a difficult notion to come to terms with, right? You're telling me that paradox, things that cannot be resolved, two things necessarily or more cannot be resolved in a system, may just be the way reality actually functions. I mean, that's not, it's so antithetical to everything that we've been, taught about the world. We've been given this notion that, the world is just waiting for discovery, that if we just kind of can map it all out, if we can chart out the territory, then we'll be masters of this domain. There will be no secrets. How often do we hear that? But if the reality is far stranger, if it's far more complicated, if a paradox is baked in, then it changes the entire game. It really does. And I think that is what is at stake here. I think when you look at things like we've talked about on this show many, many times, from quantum mechanics to the nature of reality itself, it's clear to me that reality is much more like a dreamscape than it is like, sort of a lab experiment or scientific experiment that you can replicate. It's not like that. And so when I take that approach and I kind of then shift it over to what we see here in the UFO phenomenon, it does begin to make more sense of it all. It doesn't, kind of tie it up with a nice little bow, but it does mean, or it allows me to see it and see the kinds of effects that we're hearing about through a totally different lens that leaves room for that strangeness, because the strangeness is part of the entire thing.
Indeed. And again, Bernardo has talked about that in terms of we assume that nature will follow the axiomatic logic that is part of our evolutionary history. It has no obligation to do so. He would also argue that some of the absurd elements that leak in sometimes are some of those outliers pointing to a much more complex reality beyond our usual perception. I'd like to finish by complicating matters just a little bit more and saying that in addition to what we're talking about here, I want to point out that at different stages of consciousness, how you understand things literally changes. Even to the point where I would argue your relationship with reality evolves. Your ability to work with reality changes as you understand it differently. Those are kind of hand in hand, which is part of the dreamscape. But in the expanding awareness class last night, I showed this great image of a cylinder and then shining light at the cylinder. And on one wall, what is cast against the wall in shadow is a square. And on the opposite wall, what's cast against the wall is a shadow of a circle. So you actually have three realities. You have this three-dimensional object that's a cylinder, a round cylinder, but when you shine a light breadthways across it, you end up with a square or rectangle on the wall. If you look at it from the other side, from one of the ends that highlights the circle, then you're going to get the shadow representation of a circle. All three are true. And here we speak about dimensionality and how that changes reality, right? So for instance, I remember hearing that ants tend to only think about a 2D world because they can climb up walls or walk along floors in pretty much the same way. So they really only have to perceive reality in 2 dimensions. We understand through this great short story that was done around Flatland that to a 2D kind of being, a 3D manipulation of their environment would be really, really confusing. It would manifest in very strange ways when you have to reduce it to a lower dimensional frame. This might be what's going on with the phenomenon many times. And what I would also point out is that even with stages of human consciousness, people literally see things differently. We think about, even in the formation of our country, there's talk about self-evident truths. But the truth is, it's only at a certain stage of consciousness that those truths are self-evident in that way. To later stages of consciousness or earlier ones, the self-evident truths will be inherently different. So this comes into this too, that even when we try to nail down what is going on, not only might paradox be baked in, but depending on your stage of consciousness, the reality that you interact with will be different because you see it differently and you are in a relationship with it. That is one equation. How you interact with reality and how reality interacts with you is one really complex situation that evolves over time. So there is no static reality that we can nail down. Not only does objectivity not really exist, and that's become clear, realism is defeated because of quantum mechanics, but even this notion that we stay the same and see the same world, that also gets thrown out the door as well.
Well, this is such a topical point because we really are living in a time in which what is true is rapidly changing and really almost exists in a kind of superposition in the world. We've talked about it before, and I think even if you're outside of UFO circles, you're talking about this in your friend groups. How can so many people living in the same space, in the same planet or country or what have you, have such vastly different perspectives on what is true, what reality actually is? And so, in some ways, I've been guilty of having that conversation and bemoaning, why can't we all just sort of be on the same page like we used to in the olden times? Everyone had these clear notions of what was true. There weren't all these like wildly subjective realities that seem to exist. But what if it's that very reality, the reality that we're experiencing now, where things are so much more fluid, where truth is so much more dynamic? What if needing to experience that in all its wildness, strangeness, frustrations, etc., prepares us for the way reality actually is? And as you point out, it sort of is a function of our perspective. It is a function of our conscious development. And the only way to get there, to really adopt that position entirely, fully grasp it, is to be immersed in it. And we are living in a time of real direct immersion in that kind of chaos, if you will, where true is neither true or false. It's much more complicated, and maybe that's just the kind of environment that is required, and also why we're seeing more of what we're seeing with the UFO phenomena, for it to be more known to us and to change the world that we live in now.
Absolutely agreed, and I think that several people have made this point. Bernardo has made this point. I think even Foya has made this point on different occasions, and that is that what the phenomena may be trying to do, and here we're talking about the element that is non-human, that is maybe even beyond the way we conceive of what life is. What it's doing is not about trying to give us something to fit into our existing paradigm of the world, but is literally trying to transcend and, by definition, therefore, collapse our current definition of the world. And not just because they think it would be nice for us to know, but perhaps because the bottleneck we're now entering into, where there is these numerous different extinction level threat to our existence, the only way we get out of this is through a truly new way of thinking that transcends the previous thinking. Einstein said you can never solve a problem from the same level of consciousness that created it. We're seeing it to some degree, that we now have such technological capacity that we're hitting this bottleneck where our old way of seeing the world is insufficient to get across this particular Rubicon. So you could argue that the complexification of reality that's happening in our midst is for that purpose, probably for other reasons as well, because again, we don't want to dumb this down and oversimplify. But I think there's definitely something to the notion that there are ascendant beings trying to wake us up to this broader reality, not just about what's around us, but who we are, and us being multidimensional beings as well. And that this particular lifetime is just one refraction of a larger kind of meta-soul. So I think all of that's in play, and not just because it's fun to think about, but because it might be necessary for us to get past this particular point in our history.
Yes, well said. Have many frames available to you, because you're going to need them, and don't just settle on one pair, right? Be willing to have several at hand and interchange them all the time. This has been a really enjoyable conversation for me. We covered a lot of territory with it. Where we landed, I was, particularly enriched by. So thank you for all of that. And thank you to our listeners for sharing this time with us. It means so much to us that you shout out the show or share it with your friends. Leave us a comment. We do read all of them. It's very, very helpful for us to understand, how this material is or isn't resonating with all of you. And we look forward to the next show. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the spring here, or whatever time of the year you may be listening to this show. And on that note, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.